Knowledge Products presents The Giants of Philosophy, narrated by Charlton Heston. This is tape number 1 on St. Augustine.
The year's 386 AD. The place, Milan, Italy. Imagine you're looking into a garden by the home of a well-to-do Milanese citizen. Suddenly, a man in his early 30s comes rushing out of the house. He's obviously distraught, beating his forehead, tearing at his hair. Then he stops, stares fixedly at his outstretched arm, and with great deliberation clenches and unclenches his fist. For some reason, this makes him cry out in exasperation, pound his forehead again. Then he throws himself down by a fig tree and bursts into a flood of tears. He cries for some time, but then suddenly quiets. He raises his head, listening, confused. Then he seems to hear a sound. A look of eagerness comes over his face. He gets up, dashes back towards the house, picks up a book he'd left lying there. He rips the book open, glances at the first page he comes on, and suddenly his face is bathed in an expression of peace and bliss. We've just traveled back in time to witness one of human history's great turning points, the conversion of Aurelius Augustine. He was to become the famous St. Augustine, Bishop of Hippo Regius in his native northern Africa, and one of the Western world's most influential thinkers. Augustine would remind us that we've witnessed his conversion only from the outside. What's really going on here, inside the man we've been watching then? Obviously, some drama of interior torment is being played out behind the facade of these grotesque gestures. In his autobiography, The Confessions, written some 10 years later, Augustine himself looks back on this scene of inner conflict and how it resolves itself.
Behold, I heard a voice coming from a nearby dwelling, the voice of someone, boy or girl, I could not tell, repeating in a kind of sing-song over and over. Pick it up, read it. Pick it up, read it. I got to my feet, for I took this to be nothing else but a command from God, that I should open the book of St. Paul's epistles and read from the first chapter I should stumble on.
Now Augustine tells us that his eyes immediately fell on one particular capitulum, what we'd call in English a chapter subdivision or chapterlet.
I snatched up the book, opened it, and silently read the first chapterlet on which my eye fell.
This chapterlet was from the 13th chapter of a letter which the Christian apostle Paul had written to the Roman Church of the first century. That letter has since been canonized as one of Christianity's inspired writings, and it was known as the Epistle to the Romans. The entire chapterlet ran from verse 11 to verse 14, but in spite of having read verses 11 and 12, Augustine actually quotes only verses 13 and 14 in his Confessions. Here, literally translated, are the verses 11 and 12, which he passes over.
And knowing that this is the time, and now is the hour, for us to rise up from sleep. For our salvation now is closer than it was when first we believed. For night is passing, and day approaching. Let us, therefore, cast aside the works of darkness, and garb ourselves in the armor of light.
Now we come to the two verses Augustine actually quotes.
Let us walk honorably, as in daylight, not in rioting and drunkenness, not in promiscuity and licentiousness, not in contentiousness and mutual envy, but garb yourselves in the Lord Jesus Christ, and make no provision for your fleshly concupiscences.
That entire chapterlet from the Christian Scriptures, both its quoted and unquoted portions, struck Augustine powerfully. It seemed nothing less than a providential answer, point for point, to the tormenting issues behind that scene in the garden. As we'll see, Augustine, at the time of this episode, had lived, like many young men and women, a life of intellectual pursuits, of satisfying accomplishments, even of earthly delights. But he'd found no meaning in any of these. His conversion episode was to change fundamentally how he looked on life and the rewards it offers. The answers he found were to influence philosophers, theologians, and ordinary people, right up to the present day. As a young man of 32 years, Augustine was struggling with the problems of finding philosophical and religious truth. His pious mother, Monica, had striven to raise him in the faith of the church that Augustine refers to as the Cattolica. The term Catholic means universal. For Augustine, it designated the constellation of local churches spread from end to end of the known world, which maintained contact with each other and with the Church of Rome. This universality differentiated the Cattolica from a number of heretical sects, which tended to stay confined in some particular locality. Augustine's difficulties with Catholic teaching drove him out of the Catholic Church into one such heretical sect, which was called Manichaeism. From there he drifted into the despair of skepticism. His intellectual and religious wanderings nearly broke the heart of his saintly and determined mother, Monica, but faithfully, persistently, or to be candid about it, obstinately, she plodded after him, first to Carthage, then to Rome, and finally to Milan. In Milan, however, all of Augustine's intellectual doubts and difficulties were finally resolved. In mind, in intellectual conviction, he'd already returned to the Catholic Church of his childhood faith. What caused him agony now was his moral impotence. He found he was able to will, to accomplish by willing, all sorts of external bodily actions, but at the same time he was incapable of mastering the spiritual impulses within himself. Paradoxically, the will could effectively command all of his powers except itself.
If I tore my hair and beat my forehead, I did so because I willed it. Yet I did not succeed in doing that which attracted me as incomparably more desirable. It was easier for the body to obey the soul's slightest command than for the soul to obey itself and to accomplish wholly within the will a great act of willing.
Reading his entire account of this garden scene, looking for the same elements as those contained in the chapterlet from Romans, we see Augustine telling us that there was something he found himself helpless to decide on. To decide, that is, by willing it totally, without reservation. But what was that something? He answers, to embrace the kind of life he'd come to feel himself most deeply longing to adopt. What kind of life was that? Again, he answers, the life of uncompromising service as Miles Christi, a soldier of Christ. These were the terms of the inner conflict that drove Augustine into that garden. That conflict would give rise to meditation after meditation on the roles played by the three elements Augustine saw as interacting: human freedom, the bondage of sinful habit, and our need for divine assistance, or grace. His weaker half, he tells us in the Confessions, kept murmuring, later, later, just a little while, like a sleeper lazily putting off the moment of getting up. At the same time, his better half screamed insistently, now, why not now, not tomorrow, not in a little while, but right this instant. As if to settle the dispute, Paul's text replied, now, this is the hour to rise from sleep, now. Impossible, Augustine's weaker self whimpered. He'd tried to marshal all the power of his will to make the leap into the new kind of life that beckoned him. He simply didn't have the strength for it. He'd long relished the delights of sex. The glittering prizes of worldly ambition had him spellbound. Those emotional ties to marriage and success were proving too strong for him to break. He could clench his fists and move his limbs, but to achieve what he most deeply desired, that, ironically, still remained stubbornly beyond his reach. Be reassured, Paul's text replied again. Your salvation is nearer than when you first believed. It was as if Paul were saying to him, you've been relying too much on your own strength, acting as though you could be your own providence, a providence you hoped could guarantee the satisfaction of your earthly hopes and desires. At this point, the words from Paul's letter to the Romans reinforced those which that beauteous ideal, the Lady Continence, had earlier spoken to him in a vision.
Why do you rely on yourself, and so find no standing ground at all? Cast yourself on God. Fear not, he will not draw back and let you fall. Cast yourself on him in all security. He will welcome and heal you.
Every element of that text from Romans spoke to one or another facet of Augustine's experience of moral impotence. Let God be your strength, it suggested. Cast your cares on him. Let him take you up as a mother would her child and carry you where you long to go. Let him be the one who strips off your worldly trappings and garbs you in the armor of Christ's soldiery. Having come to the end of St. Paul's chapterlet, Augustine tells us,
I had no wish to read any further. There was no need. In the very instant when this sentence ended, it was as though a light of complete security poured into my heart, and all the darkness of uncertainty fled utterly away.
He closes the book, rises, turns toward the house. As he does, he meets his lifelong friend, Alypius, who's followed him into the garden and watched in silent amazement. Alypius asks what his companions just read. Augustine shows him. Alypius reads the very next verse, and it persuades him to join Augustine in entering God's service as a soldier of Christ. This was how Augustine saw the terminus of his conversion in that garden. Soon after he was baptized by Bishop Ambrose, his mother died on their homeward journey to Africa. Eventually, he and a couple of friends arrived back in his native Thagaste and settled down to live as servants of God. We would probably think of Augustine and his companions as living like contemplative monks, studying, discussing, meditating, and praying. But this idyllic experience wasn't destined to last. Augustine's reputation for learning and holiness grew. 5 years after his conversion at Milan, his bishop summoned him to accept ordination as a priest. 4 years after that, he was consecrated bishop of the important seaport city Hippo Regius. Some 3 more years passed. Then, roughly between the years 397 and 400, Augustine wrote in 13 books the masterpiece that we know as his Confessions. He was then in his early 40s. It was some 10 years after the event when he recounted the climactic moments of his conversion. Scholars all down the centuries have come to agree that to understand St. Augustine's way of thinking, we can't do better than to begin with the dramatic episode in that Milanese garden. All the major themes of Augustine's thought emerged and developed from the way he came to understand his life experience, but as he saw it, that came to a climax in his conversion in that garden. Augustine was convinced that his experience was not unique, but typical of ours. He thought of his life as essentially the story of every man. Further, he believed that all human conversions are in fact reversions, literally returns, to a blissful union with God which all of us once enjoyed and sinfully turned away from. Augustine loves to play with words, and no word more inspired him to impromptu variations than the diverse forms of that Latin word for turn, vertere. So Augustine prays for all of us and pleads with God.
Because we have averted ourselves from you, we have become perverted. Now let us revert, O Lord, so as not to be subverted.
But there's a serious point to all this wordplay. Augustine means to impress us with his belief that we've all, like him, turned away from God. He believes this idea is expressed in the biblical account of creation, where sinful mankind's relationship to God is symbolized by Adam's aversio, or turning away from his Creator. In this view, we've become both perverted and inverted, topsy-turvy creatures facing and moving in the wrong direction. So Augustine tells us that all of us need to be turned about, turned back, converted by God's gracious help in order to revert to our original condition of blissful, peaceful union with God. Augustine symbolizes that return in several ways. He portrays our conversion, for example, as bringing us back to the joy and security of our Father's house, which all of us once enjoyed, even if we've forgotten it. In doing so, he likens every human being to the prodigal son of St. Luke's Gospel, that independent-minded youth who turned his back on the happiness of home and wandered so far off that he almost completely forgot the home he'd come from. Eventually, though, the prodigal son made his way back, literally, returned to the bliss he'd known. Augustine also describes our conversion as a return to the tender care of a mothering God, another biblical image frequently employed by the prophet Isaiah. So in his Confessions, which Augustine wrote as an unbroken, prayerful dialogue with God, he can exploit that feminine motif by praying for his fellow sinners like this.
Let them be turned back, and behold, you, Lord, are there in their hearts, in the hearts of those who confess to you, and cast themselves upon you, and weep on your breast, after all their rugged ways. Then do you gently wipe away their tears, and they weep all the more, and rejoice the more in weeping, because you, Lord, not any man of flesh and blood, but you, Lord, their Maker, remake and console them.
Augustine exploits that feminine motif even more daringly when he poetically evokes the experience of religious conversion. In this connection, though, he portrays God in terms that are far more conjugal than maternal. Many of his 5th century readers, he hopes, will irresistibly be reminded of comparable scenes from their school-day readings. Aeneas, the founder of Rome, pining for the lovely Queen Dido he'd left behind in Carthage. Or Homer's Odysseus, voyaging off from Ithaca to Troy, and long years later returning to his faithful Penelope. He implicitly likens himself to these love-struck voyagers when he prays as follows.
Late have I come to love you, beauty ever ancient, ever new. Late have I come to love you. You called, cried out to me, and shattered my deafness. You flashed forth and brightened on me, and scattered my blindness. You sent forth your fragrance. I breathed it in, and now pant for you. I have tasted, and now hunger and thirst for you. You have touched me, and I burn for your peace.
Augustine seems unable to make up his mind. Is this conversion a return to the lap of a mother we've run away from, or to the passionate embraces of some beloved beauty we deserted? Like some impish schoolboy, Augustine seems to answer, smiling, both, of course. And he promptly complicates matters even more when he portrays himself returning, as the prodigal son did, to his father. The logic of the poet's imagination lives quite comfortably with such seeming contradictions. Augustine explains that mother and mistress are both merely images drawn from the sense world. Both images attempt, more or less successfully, to help us understand that loftier reality, that purely spiritual God described in the Bible with such a lush variety of images. Yet this explanation can't entirely explain Augustine's unmistakable fondness for feminine images of God. A Freudian, of course, would instantly suggest that his feminine images betray an unresolved Oedipal complex. Conversion, to Augustine's unconscious mind, must have implied a return to Monica, the mother-mistress he'd spent so many years trying to escape. There may be some truth in this Freudian interpretation, but only a partial truth. Augustine's psychological makeup was too rich to be explained in such an oversimplified way. But there can be little doubt about it. One important aspect of Augustine's voyage and return was to wander away from and eventually return to the woman he regularly calls his earthly mother, Monica. Oddly, Augustine's father, Patricius, seems to have played a much less important part in his son's psychological life. From Monica and Patricius, Augustine seems to have inherited a physique that was slight, even fragile. His health was never strong. But his features, especially his light brown complexion, would have told us instantly that this was no native Italian. Augustine had been born in North Africa, in a smallish town, Thagaste, located in the hills of what we know now as Tunisia. Judging from her name, his mother Monica would have had at least some of the Berber blood native to that area. His father's name, Patricius, was Roman. He was a modestly placed and moderately paid functionary of the far-flung Roman Empire, which then ruled North Africa as one of its many provinces. So Patricius may have had a good measure of Italian blood in him. In any event, it seems clear that Augustine was not black, like Africans from other parts of that continent. But in Milan, both his looks and his accented speech would have given him away as a foreigner, a provincial. What then was Augustine doing in Milan? The answer's quite remarkable. Despite all the snobbishness of the Milanese towards such Carthage-educated bumpkins, this young parvenu had beaten all the competition for the prized appointment as municipal rhetor, or what we might call professor of rhetoric for the city of Milan. To measure his achievement accurately, it has to be kept in mind that during this period of history, Milan had replaced Rome as the imperial city. It was the political power center of the Roman Empire, and rival to Rome as a center of culture. His position gave Augustine a platform for displaying his oratorical powers on state occasions. It was not only his duty to praise the emperor. More significantly, he had to explain and advocate the emperor's policies. He became something very like a minister of propaganda. The post, then, was an important one for itself, but it was also a doorway toward higher positions of power. Augustine describes how he'd mused on his prospects at Milan. He admits that the trappings of mundane success still seemed attractive to him.
Such worldly goods are agreeable and provide no little sweetness of their own. We must not lightly cut our ties to them, because it would be shameful to abandon, then return to them again. And look at how much effort has already been invested toward obtaining a place of honor. Think, too, of how much more we have to hope for. We have plenty of powerful friends, and if we wanted to press matters, we could be accorded at least a governorship.
So Augustine could confidently aspire to the governorship of some imperial province, perhaps, who knows, even in his native North Africa. It was a tribute to his mother Monica that her boy, still in his early 30s, had become so brilliant a success and now enjoyed so promising a future. Augustine never lets us forget that from his earlier years his mother was fiercely ambitious for him. Monica seems to have insisted that a generous chunk of Patricius's modest income be spent in educating their talented son. Nor does he ever conceal how much his own eventual conversion was delayed, not only by the strength of his sexual desires, but by worldly ambition as well.
It was impressed on me that it was right and fitting for a boy such as I to obey those who advised me. That way I might prosper in this world and shine in the art of speaking. That way I would gain honor from my fellow men and deceitful wealth.
Augustine had been spotted early on as a very promising boy. He began his schooling in Thagaste, but was sent off in his early teens to tap the greater educational advantages in nearby Medora. While he was at Medora, however, his father Patricius found that the family purse was just about empty. Augustine had hoped to spend his 16th year in dangerous idleness back home at Thagaste until the coffers were somehow replenished. From Medora, he was sent on to Carthage for higher studies. The best that North Africa could provide was none too good for Monica's brilliant boy. At Carthage, during his 18th and 19th years, 3 things happened which marked Augustine for the rest of his days. First, he got married. Second, he read Cicero's dialogue, the Hortensius. And third, he joined an heretical religious sect, the Manichees. Let's look first at his marriage. It must be seen in context, first in terms of the kind of place Carthage was then. Augustine surrendered utterly to its prevailing erotic atmosphere.
A bubbling cauldron of shameful loves seethed about me on every side. I was not yet in love, but I was in love with love. I kept searching around for someone to love, for loving itself was what I loved. And to love and be loved was all the sweeter to me if I also enjoyed my loved one's body.
Like many a young romantic before and after him, Augustine seems to have flitted promiscuously from one passionate adventure to another. But taken all in all, he seems to have been a normally sexed North African youth, about average for the Carthage of his day. He was probably not the randy monster of lust that's sometimes been pictured. In time, though, his passion focused on one young woman. Eventually, she became, not exactly his concubine, but something closer to what we'd term his common-law wife. It's often been remarked, somewhat suspiciously, that Augustine never once reveals her name. But it's worth comparing that silence to another in the Confessions. In the 4th book of his Confessions, Augustine recounts the story of a youthful friendship with a lad of his own age. The reader's tempted to guess that this was the one perfect friendship in Augustine's life. In any case, that friend's untimely death came close to breaking Augustine's heart. Yet, as with his common-law wife, Augustine never tells us his friend's name. It should also be noted that Augustine tells us this much about his wife. He took conscientious care both of her and of the son she bore him, and he remained faithful to her for the 14 years of their union. When that union was finally dissolved, moreover, it seems to have been far more Monica's doing than Augustine's. The second important event during Augustine's stay at Carthage was his reading of Cicero's dialogue, Hortensius. It may seem strange for him to single out the reading of one particular book, yet he ranks it as important in his life as his marriage and his religious conversion. He writes about it again and again, emphasizing how decisive it was for him. Augustine describes the book as Cicero's exhortation to the philosophical life. He read it during his 19th year. Here's what he says.
That book rechanneled my whole way of feeling and directed my prayers toward you, Lord. It transformed all my hopes and desires. All at once, my every empty ambition seemed to me worthless, and I yearned with incredible ardor of heart for the immortality of wisdom, and I began to rise up, so as to return to you.
After he'd read the Hortensius, there was always something half-hearted about Augustine's worldly ambitions. Even before reading it, he may already have begun to rise up like the prodigal of Luke's gospel in order to return to his father. Now, however, he's been set afire with longing for a wisdom which is clearly otherworldly. In describing this longing, Augustine quite typically evokes the sexual motif. Cicero's inflamed him with the passionate ardor of a lover for his beloved.
How inflamed I was, my God, how inflamed to fly back from earthly involvements to you, and I knew not what you were accomplishing within me. For wisdom is with you, but the Greek word for the love of wisdom is philosophy, and those writings had inflamed me with that love. I took delight in this exhortation for one reason only, that its whole tenor sparked and set me afire, and inflamed me to cherish and seek, to grasp, hold fast, and embrace with all my strength, not this or that particular philosophical sect, but wisdom herself, whatever she might be. Only one thing checked my blazing desire, that the name of Christ went unmentioned.
Augustine goes on to explain why the absence of Christ's name reigned in his passion.
As an infant, I had drunk in the name of Christ, my Savior and God's Son, along with my mother's milk. I had cherished that name piously, and treasured it always in the depths of my heart. Hence, no masterpiece in which that name failed to appear, however learned, polished, and truthful it might be, could bear me away entirely.
That final admission is remarkable. If we take his word for it, there's little or no basis for thinking that Augustine was ever a pagan, an unbeliever in any real sense of that term. The implication, though, is puzzling. Could he be telling us that his eventual conversion was not, as is frequently assumed, from paganism to Christianity? There's another question about Augustine's experience of reading Cicero's Hortensius. That incident's come to be known as his first conversion. But apart from that, the episode calls attention to Augustine's way of communicating with his audience. He portrays this experience in a series of allusions, most of them biblical. These allusions can go right over the heads of contemporary readers and even some translators. Even after our attention's been called to them, they can still strike us as so many private Augustinian code words. But his contemporaries lived in a more oral or speech-centered culture than ours. Their ears were far more sensitive to verbal allusions. They were far more at home with the resources of Latin than we moderns could ever be. So, for example, where Augustine portrays himself as rising up and returning to his father, his readers would immediately recognize that as an allusion to the prodigal son, who St. Luke's Gospel portrays as doing precisely that. Similarly, when Augustine writes that wisdom is with God, apud te, that phrasing would have caught the attention of his Christian contemporaries. The prologue to St. John's Gospel begins with this familiar sentence.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This was in the beginning with God.
But in telling us that the eternal Word is with God, the Latin version of the Bible Augustine read used a somewhat unusual preposition, apud. His use of that same preposition would surely have reminded his readers of St. John's prologue. They may well have considered it striking that a secular writer like Cicero could inspire Augustine to elevate his hopes and ambitions and embrace the same divine wisdom familiar to them from Scripture. But it's typical of Augustine to forge such amalgams of philosophy and religion. On this point, as on many others, he would have stuck fast to his guns. A closer scrutiny of Augustine's expressions shows that he's portrayed this eternal wisdom as quite manifestly a she, a distinctly feminine reality for whom he burns with the same ardent desire with which a lover burns to possess his beloved. How would we expect Augustine's audience to react to this? The answer depends partly on how familiar they were with the Old Testament. Notice, for example, how unmistakably feminine, even erotic, is Solomon's portrait of wisdom.
Wisdom is radiant and unfading, and she is easily discerned by those who love her. She hastens to make herself known to those who desire her. She graciously appears to them in their paths. I loved her and sought her from my youth. I became enamored of her beauty, and I desired to take her for my bride.
Passages like these go far to explain why Augustine so often describes his God in a way that shifts bewilderingly from being father to mother to mistress and back again to father. There's a moral in all this. When you read Augustine, you have to read very carefully. We still have a lot to learn, especially about the rich, elusive prose poetry of his confessions. We've examined two significant occurrences in Augustine's 19th year, his common law marriage and his reading of Cicero's Hortensius. A third thing also happened in that same year. Augustine was converted to Manichaeism. This was a sect named after its founder, a learned Persian named Mani. He had elaborated a religious view of the universe made up of mythical beliefs along with commonly accepted truths from reason. These he combined more or less coherently with selected strands lifted from the Christian New Testament. The result, his Manichae followers sincerely felt, was a spiritual version of Christianity, purified of what they considered unworthy carnal elements, mostly derived from the Jewish Old Testament, which they despised. This is how Augustine later describes his encounter with this group.
And so I fell among men, delirious with pride, excessively carnal-minded and talkative. The snares of the devil were in their mouths, and they baited their traps by jumbling together the syllables of your name with that of the Lord Jesus Christ, and that of the Paraclete, our Comforter, the Holy Spirit. These names were never absent from their mouths.
This description reads very much like an indictment, but we can see between the lines what attracted Augustine to this sect. His ardor for Cicero's Hortensius was cooled only by the fact that Christ's name was not mentioned there. The Manichaees, in contrast, were forever trumpeting the names of Christ, the Heavenly Father, and the Holy Spirit. Augustine can see now, in hindsight, that Mani had also mixed up those elements of Christian belief with falsities drawn from elsewhere, but he doesn't suggest that he detected that contamination then. Quite the contrary. If we're to appreciate the dynamics of Augustine's conversion and the system of thought he evolved from thinking about his life experience, we must first be clear that the Manichaees proclaimed themselves Christians. Indeed, they claimed to be truer, more authentic, and more intelligent Christians than the Catholics of Africa. The Manichaees were convinced, moreover, that their religious system would stand up to the test of reason. Recalling those times in the work entitled On the Usefulness of Believing, Augustine writes,
Why did we fall in with those men? It was precisely because they kept saying that without appealing to fearsome authority, but by pure and simple reason, they would lead us to God, and free from error any and all who were willing to listen to them. They said that we Catholics were raised in superstitious terror, being commanded to believe before exercising our reason. But they promised that they would never urge us to believe except in truths they had first unfolded and explained to us. Who would not be enticed by such promises, especially a young man with a mind thirsting for the truth, but a proud mind as well, made garrulous by discussions with learned academics?
Clearly, then, the Manichees thought of themselves as true Christians, rational and critical, but no less genuinely Christian for that. For as long as he was a Manichee, Augustine almost certainly considered himself a believing Christian, only a more sophisticated, thinking Christian than his mother and his Catholic acquaintances. The candid self-portrait at the end of his recollection is worth pondering. Augustine had a very keen, inquiring mind. The training which would make him a professional rhetor had already sharpened it enough to catch any flaws or inconsistencies in an opponent's argument. Augustine always would remain an accomplished debater. Many of his works became records of the controversies that kept him occupied to the end of his days. He seems also to have had a proud and fiery temperament, quick to resent any attempts to hoodwink or bully him intellectually. In his middle years, when writing his Confessions, Augustine could still vividly recall one such attempt at intimidation. He remembers how the Manichees loved to tease Catholics with this question.
What was God doing before he made heaven and earth? I do not give the answer someone is said to have given to that question, evading its force by making a joke. He was getting hell ready, he said, for people who probe into such profound matters.
Clever ploy, Augustine the bishop admits. But he seems both angry and saddened by such cheap debating victories, even when scored by a Catholic over a Manichee. But surely this incident also encapsulated for him the flavor of North African Catholicism, which he and other companions of his youth came to resent bitterly. The African clergy were authoritarian. They frequently insisted on a dumb, uncritical belief, no matter how difficult or contradictory that belief might seem to the sincere questioner. This demand for a blind, unquestioning belief, Augustine always thought, was faith that had become unmitigated anti-intellectualism. His lifelong attitude found its pithiest expression in his letter to a fellow Catholic, Consentius, some years later. Intellectum valde ama, he urges his friend. Do not undervalue, but love, dearly love, understanding.
This is the end of Side 1. Please fast forward and turn over your cassette.
Augustine was convinced that the God who asks us to believe that he has sent his Son to redeem us is the same God who gives us the brains to glean some understanding of that mystery. So when the Manichees promised that they would treat him as a reasonable and intelligent adult, the young Augustine found that promise irresistibly appealing. And we owe it partially to the Manichees that the heart of Augustine's own philosophy turned out to be one lifelong effort to reflect on the religious faith that was in him and bring it to the level of understanding. His personal brand of philosophy is intensely religious, even mystical in flavor, but his religion will never demand consent to any proposition which violates philosophical good sense. But there was a second facet to the Manichees' appeal, and it also sprang from their reliance on the power of reason. They claimed that they alone could make sense of the whole array of evils that human beings encounter at practically every turning of their lives. Their favorite question to Catholic Christians was this: whence do evils come? That question, the Manichees were convinced, would infallibly point up a devastating weakness in the Catholic position. On the face of it, they were right, for Catholics insisted that the New Testament grew out of the Old, and is continuous with it. Hence, like the Jews, Catholics believed that the same one God created everything, visible as well as invisible, bodily realities as well as spiritual. Did their God, then, create such harmful creatures as the scorpion, the asp, the mosquito? What utter impiety, the Manichees thought. What sheer blasphemy to accuse the good God of having created such obviously evil beings. Augustine assures us that precisely that pious conviction had induced him to believe in the fundamental cosmic dualism the Manichees propounded, a dualism of good versus evil. Later, he came to see things otherwise.
They are not healthy-minded, Lord, who object to anything you have created, just as I was sick-minded in objecting to many things you had created. And because in my mind I refused to consider my God objectionable, I refused to admit that you could be creator of anything I objected to. That was why I wandered off to embrace the theory of two cosmic substances. But I found no rest in that theory, only raved madly on.
Madness, he came to think of it. And yet, for some 9 years, from age 19 to age 28 or 29, Augustine believed that there must be two distinct and opposed cosmic principles. One is responsible for everything pure and good, the other for everything vile and evil. The Manichees imagined their principle of goodness as having been originally a serene expanse of pure and beauteous radiance. This goodness was a sea of light, stretching infinitely in all directions but one. It was blocked from expanding in that one direction because of a turbulent, horrid, and smoky darkness, a strident confusion of beings, ugly, misshapen, and furiously jealous of the light. That race of darkness, they explained, had once upon a time invaded the realm of light and carried off into this lower realm those sparks of the divine light which are our souls. Augustine later charged the Manichees with thinking of all this carnal-mindedly, that is, drawn from the senses. Because of their materialism, their confident solution to the problem of evil was riddled with contradictions. Augustine later realized that he'd been unable to conceive of evil in satisfactory terms.
The vision of my eyes was limited to bodies, and my mind's vision to phantasms. I did not know that God is a spirit, whose members are not extended in length and breadth, and for whom to be is not identical with having a certain mass. For a being with mass is less in any given part than in its whole, and even granting that it be infinite, it is less in any given part, spatially marked off, than in its infinity. Also, it is never everywhere whole and undivided, as a spirit is, as God is.
The Manichees saw humanity as a monstrous union of soul and body, of spiritual divinity imprisoned in the material body. And the body ultimately derives, like all things material, from the anti-God, the race of darkness. A number of ethical beliefs followed from that Manichean view. For one thing, our souls, precisely since they are sparks of the divinity, are thought to be perfectly innocent of all wrongdoing. If we seem to do wrong, the Manichees would attribute those evil actions to our material bodies. It was the body, for instance, not the soul, which yearned for the pleasures of sex. So the Manichees could shrug, let the body have its sex. The soul would remain perfectly uninvolved, perfectly innocent of such activity. But two restrictions had to be observed. First, every effort must be made to avoid conceiving children, since procreation imprisons the divine soul in matter for one or possibly several future generations. And secondly, those who engaged in sexual activity could never be admitted to the inner circle of perfect or elect Manichees. They were condemned to remain spiritual second-class citizens. In sum, the Manichees tried to persuade the young Augustine that conception and procreation were the greatest of evils and must at all costs be avoided, that sexual activity in and for itself had no more moral significance than belching or drinking a glass of water, and yet he could never hope to achieve full status in this religion unless he broke completely with all such activity. If you deliberately tried to poison a young husband's sexual life with equal doses of moral confusion and psychological guilt, you couldn't brew a more toxic formula than Manichaeism. Nevertheless, we know that soon after his conversion to this sect, Augustine fathered a child. We also know that mother and father decided to name that child Adeodatus, gift of God. What does this mean? Sounds like a gesture of defiance to Manichae teaching, but we can learn more on that from Augustine's mature attitude towards sexuality. Augustine tells us he remained a Manichee from his 19th to his 28th year. At age 21, his studies were completed, and he moved back to his hometown of Thagaste. There he set himself up as teacher of rhetoric. At first, Monica refused to live in the same house with this young heretic. But sometime later she relented, and the two of them were again united under one roof. It's interesting that we're never told how Augustine's mother got along with the mother of his child. But Augustine does tell us at some length of a friendship he formed with a young man his own age. The two became close, but within a year the young man sickened and died. Friendships would always have great importance in Augustine's life. We can all share his grief at this cruel separation.
This sorrow plunged my heart into darkness, and wherever I looked, I saw only death. My native place was a punishment to me, and my father's house a haunting unhappiness. Everything I had shared with him was now without him, transformed into horrible torture. My eyes searched for him everywhere, but he was nowhere to be found. I hated every place that no longer contained him, nor could any place any longer promise me, "Look, here he comes." I became a mighty riddle to myself, and only tears held any sweetness for me.
Finally, Augustine decided, however illogically, that nothing would help except to flee his native soil, as the prodigal once did. He returned to Carthage and resumed his teaching there. His mother went too, praying and occasionally scheming for his conversion. Augustine's sojourn in Carthage lasted some 7 years. It seems to have been a successful period for the young professor. He continued his readings and prided himself especially on plowing unaided through a Latin translation of Aristotle's categories. Augustine's Greek was never very strong. He doesn't seem to have studied Aristotle in any greater depth than that. Augustine won a prize in a poetry competition and even produced a little book on aesthetics. Its title, On the Beautiful and the Fitting, De Pulchro et Apto, points to the central distinction around which the work is built. That distinction would become important for his later thinking.
I saw that even in bodily realities, it was one thing to be a whole, as it were, and for that reason beautiful, but quite another thing to be attractive on account of being suitably adapted to another thing, as a part of the body is to its corresponding whole, or a shoe is to the foot.
Augustine is keenly interested in questions about beauty, but he's also sensitive to that disinterested quality, that suspension of self-concern, which theorists through the centuries have proclaimed as beauty's peculiar property. This fascination with beauty will haunt Augustine all his days. We've already seen that he views his return to God primarily as a belated recognition of a beauty ever ancient, ever new. In time, Augustine began to feel some nagging intellectual difficulties with Manichee doctrine, yet each time he openly questioned some feature of Mani's teaching, he was told that only the celebrated Manichee bishop, Faustus of Miletus, was learned enough to deal with the anomalies bothering him. Faustus had promised to visit Carthage soon, and he finally did, during Augustine's final year at Carthage. The Manichees had claimed they wouldn't ask Augustine to believe anything they couldn't make clear to his reason. That claim, he'd begun to suspect, was ringing hollow. Augustine's suspicion hardened to certainty once Faustus opened his mouth. Augustine tells us,
I found that he was pleasant and charming in his manner of speech, and quite able to chatter away on the topics the others usually spoke about, only more agreeably than they could. But my ears had their fill of such things, nor did they seem better to me because they were now better expressed, nor true because elegantly expressed.
Augustine found the dear bishop to be personally attractive, a charming speaker, but definitely a second-class brain. Augustine gave up all hope of resolving his intellectual difficulties, and from this moment his allegiance to Manichaeism was broken. His quest for understanding had been frustrated. First by the fundamentalism of the Catholic clergy, but now, far more disappointingly, by the very sect which so confidently trumpeted its promise of reasoned certainty. Augustine's need for clarity and certainty had always had, and would continue to have, something anxious, perhaps even obsessive about it. It seemed to spring from some reservoir of insecurity deep inside him. But now, where in the wide world could certainty be found? The philosophies of his time didn't seem to offer much promise. Plato and Aristotle had died over 6 centuries before, and an undistinguished procession of lesser lights had taken their place. This situation left the Latin-speaking world of Augustine's time with a choice between Epicureanism, Stoicism, and academicism. The Epicureans, who were convinced materialists, taught that the main business of human life was the search for pleasure. The Stoics were materialists as well, but they emphasized every person's duty to live by the dictates of universal reason. In desperation, Augustine began to consider the only alternative he was yet familiar with.
In fact, the thought even came to me that the philosophers called academics might be more prudent than the others, for they held that everything ought to be considered doubtful, and judged that mankind could lay hold of nothing that is true.
Now in his 29th year, Augustine decided to leave North Africa and try his luck in Rome. He no longer believed in Manichaean teachings, but he didn't hesitate to profit from their political connections, both at Carthage and in Rome. Through their influence, he got a post teaching rhetoric at the very hub of Latin history and culture. But Augustine lasted only 1 year in Rome. It was a year of illness and disappointment. That year wasn't a total waste, though. He managed to catch the eye of Symmachus, the prefect of Rome, just when Symmachus was looking for someone to appoint as municipal rhetor at Milan. Soon Augustine was on his way to Milan with the appointment in his pocket. The move was fateful, or, as Augustine would put it, providential.
I came to Milan, to Ambrose the bishop, known to all the world as one of its finest men, and your devout worshipper, Lord. All unknowing, I was led to him by you, so that through him I might be led, but this time knowingly, to you.
During these years, the emperor of the western part of the Roman Empire held court in Milan. Constantine I, famous in history as the convert who became the first Christian emperor of the Roman Empire, had divided the empire into eastern and western divisions. He then went off to rule the eastern division from Constantinople. This left the western emperors free to move northward from Rome to Milan in order to be at closer grips with the troubles the German barbarians were causing on the northern frontier. Those barbarian incursions already heralded the approaching twilight of the Roman Empire, and there were any number of patriotic Romans willing to accuse the Bishop of Milan of hastening Rome's eventual downfall. Ambrose was waging a fierce campaign against the worship of the traditional Roman gods and goddesses. Many Romans believed this would deprive Rome of heavenly protection against her enemies. However much he knew about these frictions, Augustine clearly felt obliged to pay Ambrose a courtesy visit. The bishop welcomed him cordially. Ambrose's kindliness obviously warmed him. Furthermore, Ambrose's reputation as a preacher induced the young professor of rhetoric to come to his basilica and listen to him preach. Augustine tells us that Ambrose made an impression that was the exact antithesis of the one made by the Manichae Bishop Faustus. Here, matter had it all over mere manner.
Although I had no interest in learning what he spoke about, but only in his speaking technique, the things he spoke about entered at my ears along with the words he spoke. I was unable to keep them apart, so that while I opened my mind to take in how eloquently he spoke, at the same time it gradually began to enter my mind how true were the things he said.
Quite in spite of himself, however, Augustine noticed that Ambrose's Catholicism was worlds removed from the anti-intellectual fundamentalism that had repelled him in North Africa. Could it be that Catholic doctrine was not the insult to rationality that the Manichees had persuaded him to think it was? Augustine wasn't ready to go that far. Twice burnt in his quest for truth, he was now thrice shy. Yet he had to admit Ambrose was demolishing the whole string of Manichae objections to Catholicism, one after the other. Despite his persistent uncertainty, Augustine decided to enroll as a catechumen, a candidate for the baptism he had never received as an infant. So, almost casually, without any fanfare, he returned to the church of his childhood, the Cattolica. This is the spiritual state in which Monica found her son when she arrived in Milan from Africa. Day by day, the message of Ambrose was taking root. Augustine was brought to review his former hostility towards faith and authority. He saw them now as far more reasonable than the Manichees had pictured them.
I was led to realize how numberless were the things I believed without seeing them, and others which had transpired when I was not there to witness them. So many events in the history of mankind. So much that I believed on the word of friends or doctors or various others. Unless we accepted such things on trust, we would accomplish absolutely nothing in this life. And finally, I realized how firmly and unshakably I accepted on faith that I had been born of precisely these parents, something I could not possibly know unless I believed it on the word of others. In this way, Lord, you made me understand that I ought not find fault with those who believed in your Bible, which you have established with such great authority among almost all the nations of the earth, but find fault rather with those who did not believe it.
With two of his friends, Alypius and Nebridius, Augustine discusses their common quest for truth and certainty. Perhaps it occurs to them they should at long last heed the urging of Cicero's Hortensius. They should forsake their care-ridden lives of worldly activity and form a small community devoted to the philosophical way of life, a life of peaceful study and contemplation. But in that case, how could Augustine support the wife he feels he can't live without? How could he provide for his children? His need for a woman, he perceived, kept him tied down to the busy life of action. It blocked the fulfillment of the dream that had haunted him since his 19th year. Still, he couldn't suppress that dream to embrace the contemplative life. Meanwhile, Monica went quietly to work. She found a well-born Milanese girl of nearly marriageable age and pushed through the arrangements betrothing her to Augustine. This bride would be a more suitable partner for a brilliant young man with her son's promising future, far more suitable than that undistinguished commoner who'd borne his child. So one morning Augustine wakes up to find his companion of 11 years has been persuaded to leave her child and disappear in the direction of her native Africa. Augustine describes the incident with disconcerting vividness.
When my accustomed bed companion was torn from my side, as representing an obstacle to the marriage, my heart, to which she had become attached, was torn and wounded within me, and left a trail of blood. And she, meanwhile, had departed for Africa, vowing to you, Lord, that she would never know another man. Nor would that wound of mine, inflicted by the cutting away of my former companion, heal over. Rather, it became inflamed and terribly painful, then gangrenous. The pain became a freezing pain, as it were, but all the more desperate for that.
There's surely something heartless about this entire episode, but almost certainly the heartlessness was not principally Augustine's. And yet, in spite of the very real pain, the sorrow this separation caused him, Augustine's such a slave to lust that he persuades another mistress to share his bed. His prospective bride is still too young to marry. Meanwhile, Augustine continues to wrestle with a skein of intellectual problems that have been tormenting him for years. The first of those centers on the question of what must God be like.
I no longer thought of you, my God, in the shape of a human body, but I did not know how else to think of you. If I tried to think of something lacking all spatial dimensions, it seemed to me that nothing, absolutely nothing remained, not even a void.
Next comes the nagging question about the origin of evil.
I still could not find any clear explanation of where evils came from. I had been told that our own free will is the cause of evils we commit, whereas your righteous judgment causes the evils we suffer. I applied my mind in an effort to understand this, but I could not make it out clearly.
Augustine has heard Ambrose offer suggestions on many of these issues, but he's still unwilling to embrace any of them without reservations on Ambrose's authority alone. On the other hand, Augustine has no reasonable challenge to Ambrose's answers. He was once hostile even to the idea of accepting things on faith alone. Now he believes that accepting the teaching of some authority figure can be legitimate, maybe a requisite first step towards the certainty of reasoned knowledge. But he still respects the Manichae attitude to this extent. He needs to be assured that he can take the propositions Ambrose is asking him to believe and transform them into propositions he can say he genuinely knows. Suddenly, in his 32nd year, Augustine found the ways of thinking he hoped would help him transform belief into knowledge. He acquired a number of books. They were written, he tells us with maddening vagueness, by Platonists, followers of Plato. He describes the dramatic effect of these readings when writing to his former patron Romanianus.
Then lo, certain books, brimful of wisdom, as Celsinus puts it, wafted the perfumes of Araby over us, and let drop on our burning hearts the very fewest drops of their priceless unguent. Incredible, Romanianus. The result was incredible, surpassing perhaps what you yourself might believe about me. What more can I say? Those drops ignited a conflagration in me which even I would have thought incredible.
Generations of scholars have quarreled, as only scholars can, about the identity of those Platonists. The most reasonable consensus is that Augustine read Latin translations of treatises written by the prince of Neoplatonic philosophy, Plotinus. Plotinus had taught and written in Rome more than a century before. Some scholars would add the name of Plotinus's pupil, editor, and publicist, Porphyry, but most of these scholars would agree that Augustine read Porphyry's works in addition to some of Plotinus's. However they differ on these details, scholars are virtually unanimous on this much. First, Augustine's writings, even at their most religious, are regularly influenced by Neoplatonic thoughts. And second, Augustine clearly believed that on the whole, Neoplatonism provided the best philosophical categories available in his time for understanding the truths of Orthodox Christian faith. One should, of course, avoid the temptation to read into Augustine more Neoplatonism than his writings warrant. But we would be equally deceived to think that Augustine considered Neoplatonic philosophy and Christian faith as opposed to each other. Until now, almost all the philosophy Augustine had encountered was thoroughly Romanized. This was his first direct contact with a stream of authentic Greek thinking. Neoplatonism emphasized the mystical side of Plato's thought. It proclaimed insistently that humans once dwelt in the contemplative bliss of the higher spiritual world Plato described so enthusiastically. We are really souls who've somehow fallen into this bodily world of our present experience. The all-consuming aim of the wise man's life is to become purified enough to return to that vision. Augustine recounts the fruit of his Neoplatonist readings in the 7th book of his Confessions. He first outlines certain features where Neoplatonic teaching agrees with Catholic teaching. He then notes other elements where it falls short. Augustine wants to describe the tremendous profit he drew from reading the Neoplatonists, but he first warns believing Christians to read the Neoplatonists as he, of course, had done, with a suitably critical eye. First, he describes the state of intense recollection the Neoplatonists required of their disciples.
Admonished thence by those books, to return to myself, I entered into my inmost being. I entered, and with the eye of my soul, I saw. Vidi.
I saw. Augustine uses several other terms as well. He saw, that is, he beheld all reality with the inner eye of his mind. He also came to know something that became manifest or plain to his intelligence rather than to his senses. He no longer needed simply to believe in the reality he saw, to accept its existence on the authority, say, of Ambrose. He's claiming to have crossed the frontier from faith to reason. He's come to understand. He's attained the certainty for which all through the years he so ardently longed. Philosophers have helped him arrive at this series of insights, but Augustine boldly quotes Paul's epistle to the Romans in order to claim that Paul was referring to the same sort of knowledge.
I marveled that now it was you I loved, Lord, not some phantasm in your stead. I was perfectly certain that, from the establishment of the world, your invisible characteristics are glimpsed, understood, through the things you have made.
Augustine's writing as a bishop. After years of hindsight and theological reflection, he's telling us how he understands now all that happened to him some 10 years earlier, in AD 386. But are his confessions consistent with the accounts suggested in his earlier dialogues? Recent scholarship has made it ever clearer that those two accounts, earlier and later, exhibit some differences in emphasis, and yet they're remarkably consistent with one another. To test that consistency, consider the picture presented by Augustine's earliest writings. Some months after he first read these Platonic books, Augustine and several of his pupils and intimates retired to Cassette, to the country villa of his friend Verecundus. There he began writing that series of philosophical works which would be called the Cassiciacum Dialogues. The first of these dialogues significantly boasts a double title. It can be read either against or about the academics. If we compare these opening paragraphs of the Confessions with the arguments in that dialogue, it soon becomes plain that the later account is in many respects simply a distillation of the earlier dialogue. But the young Augustine's strained attempts at subtlety can sometimes camouflage the parallelism between the two accounts. For instance, he opens his dialogue in the Academics by asking his companions whether humans should be content with merely seeking after truth, even if they never actually find it. Young Tragedius answers,
We want to be happy, surely, and if we can arrive at that reality without possessing the truth, then we need not seek for the truth.
Augustine replies,
But what of that prior question? Do you all think we can, in fact, be happy, even if we have not found the truth?
Initially, this sounds like a purely philosophical question, but terms like seek, find, arrive ring distant bells. Augustine hopes his readers will remember the Manichaean interpretation of Christ's saying, Seek and ye shall find. To the Manichees, this saying urged believers to move beyond blind faith and seek for reasoned certainty. Augustine's eye is on his former co-religionists, and his question's a frankly religious one. But Augustine has mixed the metaphor of seeking and finding with another favorite metaphor, that human life is a journey. In this metaphor, the act of seeking becomes one of following a way or road, so that finding occurs when the traveler arrives at the destination he longs to reach. As the dialogue advances, however, the plot thickens even further. We discover that Augustine's also thinking of the Christ of St. John's Gospel, who tells us, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He delights in the paradox contained in his text, that the eternal Son of God the Father, utterly spiritual truth, has entered our temporal world to become an embodied way, the way to himself as the fullness of truth. But Augustine reminds his readers that taking the first step along any way may require that we take the ultimate risk of believing.
For I hold that one can go astray, not only by following the wrong way, but also by not following the true way. Imagine two travelers heading for the same place. One of them has decided to believe no one. The other is entirely too credulous. They come to a crossroads, and our credulous traveler asks a shepherd, or some rustic he sees there, Tell me, my good man, which is the best way toward such and such a place? The reply comes, Go that way, and you'll not go astray.
But this traveler's distrustful companion refuses to take the word of any peasant. He stays rooted to the spot and watches with skeptical amusement as the first man heads confidently on his way. As things turn out, this path does eventually lead him where he wants to go. Let the Manichae and the academic skeptic make fun of this credulity, but think, Augustine asks, which of the travelers reached his destination? But if the Christ of the Cattolica is Augustine's way to truth, how does the way relate to the way the Neoplatonists have shown him? He answers that question only in the closing pages of the dialogue entitled Against the Academics. But the answer is anticipated at the climax of a companion dialogue on happiness. There Augustine labors to prove that human happiness lies in our finding, that is, arriving at a direct vision of the truth. To Augustine, this truth is the eternal Christ. But that Christ is one person of the Christian Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So Augustine writes that in beholding the divine Son, we shall by the same token behold the eternal Father. This vision, moreover, will be accorded us through the working of the Holy Spirit. In the Confessions, Augustine deploys this Trinitarian symbolism even more boldly. The eternal Christ represents the truth, God the Father represents eternity, and the Holy Spirit represents divine love. So he describes the supernatural light he glimpsed at Milan.
Whoever knows the truth knows that light, and whoever knows that light knows eternity. Love knows it. O eternal truth, and true love, and beloved eternity, you are my God, and I sigh for you, day and night.
But both in his Confessions and his early dialogues, Augustine is convinced that the kind of genuine knowledge which is marked by unshakable certainty can be found only in the mind's recognition of necessary connections. 7 plus 3 not only does, but must equal 10. Augustine has come to see that up to now he'd thought knowing must be an act of sense perception. He'd assumed, like the Manichees, that knowing must always have as its object some bodily, physical reality. This had led him to conclude that nothing could be real unless it were material, extended in space, and perceivable by the senses. Even if we succeeded in imagining some immaterial and non-extended reality, it must literally be a nothing or no thing. But at Milan he came to see otherwise.
And I said to myself, truth cannot be a nothing, can it? Just because it is not spread out through finite or infinite spaces. And you shouted from afar, entirely true, I am who am. And I heard with an interior kind of hearing, and there was no longer the slightest reason to doubt. In fact, I could more easily have doubted my own existence than the existence of truth itself.
Platonism has always challenged materialists, those who rely uniquely on sense perception, by pointing to examples of mathematical and geometrical realities. To cite Augustine's favorite example once again, if you understand what the terms mean, you can't help seeing with your mind's eye that 7 plus 3 necessarily equals 10, or that a perpendicular drop from the apex of an equilateral triangle will necessarily bisect the base. A moment of reflection tells you that you see these truths precisely because of the nature of the realities you're mentally contemplating. Your conclusions are not based merely on your subjective way of seeing, but on the objective essences of the realities your mind is considering. The necessary connection in such a case is an objectively real connection. But this could not be true unless the connected essences were themselves objectively real. They're neither bodily nor extended, yet they are realities. Augustine would claim that our knowledge of them is even clearer, firmer, more indubitable than our knowledge of any bodily realities could ever be. The skeptical academic would object that the entire sense world may be something we only seem to perceive. The whole sensible universe may be nothing but the product of our dreaming, or an insane delusion. Augustine replies,
I still say that the entire bodily mass or mechanism in which we find ourselves, whether we be sane or mad, dreaming or awake, is either one or many. Show me how that opinion could ever be false. For if there be one world plus 6 worlds, it is clear that there are 7 worlds, whatever my mental state may be, and I can affirm that I know that much, with no fear of being overbold.
All through his early dialogues, Augustine exercises his readers' minds with such mathematical insights. But similar insights can be gleaned by contemplating non-mathematical realities. In taking this tack, Augustine actually anticipates the same move of the mind involved in René Descartes' famous phrase, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Augustine concisely describes this tactic in his much later work entitled On the Trinity. Notice that he argues from the knowledge of our interior states, whereby we know, for instance, that we are alive.
We have no fear in a case like this of being deceived by some false appearance or other, because it is certain that even he who is deceived must be alive. The knowledge whereby we know that we are alive is an interior kind of knowledge, where not even the academic can say, "Perhaps you are sleeping, and this is not knowledge, but only a dream vision."
Like any typical Platonist, Augustine refuses to fight philosophical skepticism by defending the idea that our sense knowledge is trustworthy. Now he tells us why.
Surely everyone knows that the things we see in dreams are very like the things we see when awake. But the person claiming that he is certain that he is alive is not making the claim, "I know I am awake," but the claim, rather, "I know I am alive." Whether awake or asleep, therefore, he is alive. And even sleeping and seeing in dreams is the work of a living being. He who claims to know that he is alive can never, therefore, either lie or be deceived.
Activities like doubting, dreaming, or being deceived all necessarily suppose that the doubter or dreamer must be alive. Augustine is so certain that this necessary connection must be true that in his Confessions he goes a remarkable step further. He asserts that the existence of truth itself is more certain to him than the truth of any individual fact, even the fact of his own existence. Augustine's convinced that no individual fact, like his own existence, could be true unless it shared in truth itself, the all-embracing truth he identifies with God. All this was implicit in that summary we heard earlier, where he speaks of truth in this loftiest sense.
And I said to myself, then truth cannot be a nothing, can it? And you shouted, and I heard with an interior kind of hearing, and there was no longer the slightest reason to doubt. In fact, I could more easily have doubted my own existence than the existence of truth itself.
At this point in his argument, we recognize that Augustine is applying the traditional Platonic doctrine of participation. This doctrine says that any individual instance of truth, goodness, or beauty must have received that truth, goodness, or beauty from an absolute truth, good, or beauty. This absolute source transcends. That is, it exists beyond or above the realm of space and time we normally experience. This doctrine of participation now permits Augustine to synthesize the Christian and Platonist views of truth. These views earlier had seemed to be two distinct and unrelated ways of seeking after truth. But now it's clear that if the God of the Catholica is the creative source of everything true and good and beautiful, then that same God must be identical with the absolute truth, goodness, and beauty that Platonists have always looked for. Just such an otherworldly truth, goodness, and beauty had been suggested by Cicero's Hortensius, which long ago fired Augustine to pursue truth with all the ardor of his passionate nature. Augustine believes his conversion at Milan was the long-delayed fulfillment of that first conversion which occurred 13 years before, when he was 19. So we find him using again the same rapturous images and near mystical enthusiasm he remembers from that time.
Up, Lord, arouse us, call us back to you, enkindle us, and bear us away. Be flame and sweetness to us. Let us love, let us run. So did I burn to follow.
But there was an important difference between the earlier and the later conversion. Cicero had summoned his readers to philosophy. This philosophy, in the meantime, had become for Augustine a far more incandescent, more intensely religious reality than Cicero himself could ever have imagined.
This is the end of tape number 1 on St. Augustine. The presentation is continued on tape number 2. This is tape number 2 on St. Augustine.
To Augustine, his conversion in Milan in AD 386 took place because God was helping him to arrive at the stage of spiritual understanding. But Augustine looks at understanding itself as a kind of halfway house between simple faith and a more ultimate arrival, the direct, immediate vision of divine beauty itself. The writings of the Neo-Platonist philosopher Plotinus repeatedly insist that the human soul is made for exactly that vision of divine beauty. But this implies a peculiar way of understanding human existence. His biographer Porphyry tells us how Plotinus felt about possessing a human body.
Plotinus seemed ashamed of being in the body. As a result of this state of mind, he could never bear to talk of his race, or his parents, or his native country.
Plotinus was convinced that there was something basically askew in the fact that our souls were encased in bodies. He thought we were originally fashioned for a purely spiritual life of unbroken contemplation. Hence, Porphyry tells us that even while in the body, Plotinus enjoyed constant contact with the divine.
Plotinus never, while awake, relaxed his intent concentration upon the divine. So to this godlike man above all, who often raised himself in thought to the first and transcendent God, that God appeared. For the end and object of his life was to be united to approach the God above all things. 4 times while I was with him, he attained that term in an inexpressible actuality, not merely in potency.
Something very like Plotinus's view of human existence rubbed off on Augustine in AD 386. He thought that our souls were never meant to be clothed in these sluggish bodies. We originally dwelt in the other higher world that Plato told us about. Humans were once rapturously contemplating God's splendorous beauty. But we've somehow, mysteriously, fallen into this embodied existence, and our souls, in their utmost depths, ache to return to that higher world. Nothing else should be of any real importance to us. So in the record of Augustine's Cassiciacum dialogues with himself, called Soliloquies, Augustine asks himself,
What do you wish to know?
I wish to know God and the soul.
Nothing more?
Nothing whatever.
The ordinary world of the senses has ceased to interest this recent convert. In fact, Augustine feels positively obliged to flee that world. He wants to purify and strengthen his mind's eye for the higher, purely spiritual vision he's come to long for. This disdain of sense knowledge, which Augustine called mere curiosity, understandably retarded the advance of empirical science in later centuries. But Augustine was confident that his Christianity and his Platonism, welded together into seamless unity, required that impatient leap into the world of the spirit. So, too, Augustine calmly characterizes the vision he seeks in frankly erotic terms that are at once Platonic and Christian. Pursuing the inquiry of his soliloquies, the voice of reason explains to Augustine.
What we are exploring at the moment is this: what kind of love you bear for wisdom.
For Augustine, this voice of reason belongs to the same otherworldly divine wisdom described in Cicero's Hortensius. Now, as years before, divine wisdom takes on the characteristic of a beautiful woman.
You long to see and clasp her, naked, chastely to behold and embrace her, stripped of every intervening veil. But she permits this only to a very few chosen lovers. Were you inflamed with love for a beautiful woman, she would be right not to yield herself to you if she discovered that you loved something beside herself. So with the most chaste beauty of wisdom, will she show herself to you unless you burn with love for her alone?
Here we've touched on the very nerve of Augustine's ethical theory. He believes our principal business in life is to arrive at the vision of God. The value of everything else must be measured as a help or hindrance in reaching that vision. In his later work, entitled On Christian Doctrine, Augustine puts it this way.
Since, therefore, our destiny is to find our joy in the vision of that truth who lives unchangeably, our minds need to be purified in order to become strong enough to glimpse that light and cling to it once glimpsed. Let us look on that process of purification as though it were something like a journey on foot, something like a sea voyage to our homeland. For it is not, of course, by spatial motions that we travel to him who is everywhere present, but by holy desire and good morals.
To Augustine, we're all on a journey, and we must never lose sight of where we're going. We're going home. That's where we want to stop at last, to stay and rest and journey no more. The inns along the way, however warm and comfortable, are only way stations on the road home. Using this metaphor of the journey towards God, Augustine says,
Of all the good things, the only goods we are meant to enjoy are those which are eternal and unchangeable. All the others are meant to be used to help us arrive at the enjoyment of those eternal goods.
Clearly, however, there's only one such eternal and unchangeable good. That's God. It's God whom we hope to behold and embrace. Augustine says that this union produces bliss. Paul the Apostle described this bliss to the Christians at Corinth in these words,
No eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor the heart of man conceived, what God has prepared for those who love him.
At this point, we've also found the key to Augustine's mature attitude towards sex. Sexual delight is like a very special amenity furnished at an elegantly appointed inn. Perhaps no other human good can rival the bewitching power of sex to make us forget our final destination. Sex can make us mistake a stopover for that destination. But the blissful union of sex is the merest shadow of the union with God that's promised us if we persevere on the homeward journey. We must admit that there's something chilling when we divide good things into those to be used as against the one divine good to be enjoyed. We instinctively believe that we can legitimately use things like bread or wine or inns, but are we meant to use our mothers, siblings, friends, to use other people? Augustine was very sensitive to this difficulty, and he tried various ways of softening its sting. He eventually concludes, for example, that we may enjoy our dear ones, but we must enjoy them in God.
Any creature we love is either our equal or our inferior. So we must love creatures below us by using them to get to God, while loving those equal to us with a love of enjoyment, by enjoying them in God.
And yet enjoying other human beings in God comes down to loving them not for their own sake, but for the sake of arriving at the enjoyment of God. Other people are like the refreshment or stopping places that sustain us on our journey. In the final analysis, Augustine's oversimple distinction that we must either use or enjoy forces him to conclude that indeed even other persons are meant to be used.
For when you enjoy another human in God, it is God you are enjoying, rather than the human being. But if you would become attached and make the one you love a kind of home, locating the end point of your joy in the beloved, then you can truly be said to enjoy him or her. And this you must never do, except with the Trinity, which is the loftiest and unchangeable good.
Augustine's teaching on love is yet one more example of his confidence that Platonic conceptions can clarify the gospel message. Indeed, during his early years as a Catholic thinker, Augustine boldly viewed Platonism as the providentially arranged way to understand the very same truths the Catholica teaches people to accept on faith. Plato reasoned that there were two worlds, one visible, the other invisible. The visible world is a blend of reality and unreality, and only the invisible, intelligible world is genuinely real. Augustine assures us that this insight helps Plato's followers to accept the words of Christ himself, "My kingdom is not of this world." There had been a time when Augustine felt that the demands of human reason clashed with the requirements of the Catholic faith. That clash, he became convinced, is an illusory one. Now he can say confidently,
No one doubts that we are drawn toward learning by the twin magnetic pull of authority and reason. I am utterly certain that I shall never diverge on any point from the authority of Christ, for I find no authority stronger than his. But as for what must be sought after through subtle reasoning, I am confident that for now I shall find among the Platonists a teaching that is not opposed to our holy mysteries. For my heart is now set on this. I have an impatient yearning, not only to believe, but also to lay hold of what is true by the power of understanding.
In the year 386, Augustine felt that all the rivers of his past had flowed together into one powerful channel. All his tensions and spiritual discords had settled into peaceful harmony. His Christian faith once had seemed to clash with his intelligence. Now faith provided him with a larger, more satisfying understanding than he'd ever dreamed possible. His passionate heart had run madly against his religious ideals. Now both his worldly ambitions and rebellious sexuality were pacified by the hope of more sublime joys than he'd ever known. Augustine could now turn from the strident contentions of his professional life. He could be still and know that God is God. Augustine entered the quiet garden of the contemplative life and closed the gate firmly behind him. We know that Augustine enjoyed a contented, even blissful state of soul for several idyllic months after his conversion at Milan. But there were problems hidden in the heart of the synthesis that had come from his meditations at Cassette. He would in time come to deal with most of them, but two are worth mentioning. In the first place, Augustine was convinced that the Christian, like any human being, must begin by believing certain things. But he was equally convinced that this stage of belief leads onward to a search for a philosophic understanding of revealed truths. Philosophical understanding, in turn, leads onward to the bliss of direct, unmediated vision. In fact, for some time after his conversion at Milan, Augustine cherished the hope that contemplative immersion in the liberal arts might prepare him to enjoy that vision, perhaps even like Plotinus, while still living in the body. But this type of Christianity is for the intellectual mystic. It's a religion requiring more than most believers could give. Augustine himself admits that such a Christian must have special qualities.
He must be equipped by nature with a good mind, blessed with the leisure which either the privilege of old age or good fortune can procure, and burning with zeal for study.
It's little wonder, then, that the simpler faith of Augustine's own mother, Monica, may have made her the most challenging obstacle to her son's thinking. Augustine strains to persuade Monica that she should not feel hostile toward the program of studies he's urging on his companions. He even flatters his mother about her faith.
Since you have already arrived at the very summit of philosophical wisdom, would I not happily enroll as your disciple? On hearing those words, my mother replied, all sweetness and charity, that I had never before lied so grandly.
Some years later, Augustine would come to realize how much wisdom was contained in Monica's good-natured mockery. There's a second problem with Augustine's conviction. He'd made the Platonic doctrine of participation a central pillar of his synthesis. That doctrine taught that all the realities of the sensible world share in the qualities they possess, because they receive their share of those qualities from the corresponding ideal realities of the higher world. Good things receive their goodness from the ideal goodness. Beautiful things receive their beauty from the ideal beauty, and so forth. But Augustine had not yet come to see that the very heart of the participation doctrine is the powerful, technical, but also very difficult insight of integral omnipresence. Let's look at this omnipresence insight negatively first. It forbids us to think of God the way the Manichees did, as an infinitely extended ocean of spiritual splendor, spread out in space, up there and out there. The spiritual world is not just a lofty counterpart of the material reality we're familiar with, spread out down here. A spiritual reality, like God or like the human soul, is not spread out that way into length and breadth, height and depth. It would be a small improvement to reverse the relationship and imagine all of created reality as being in God. This, Augustine tells us, he came to do.
I placed before my mind's eye the entire universe of creatures, as though they were all bodily realities arranged in this and that place, as imagination would have it. I made your creation into one immense mass, but finite in every respect. And I imagined, Lord, that you surrounded it on every side and interfused with it, but you were infinite in every direction, as though there were a sea, one single sea, stretching everywhere and infinitely in every direction, a boundless immensity. And that sea enclosed within itself a kind of sponge, as great in size as you please, but still finite. And that sponge was filled, obviously, in every one of its parts, filled with the immense sea.
Even in this image, part of God would be present here and another part of him there. God would not be present in the totality of his being to each and every created reality. Plotinus masterfully describes how a correct concept of integral omnipresence requires us to set aside our ordinary schemes for understanding spatially extended realities. He warns us how not to think of the omnipresent.
It is not to be thought of as coextensive with the material universe, or with any part of that universe. It is utterly outside of the quantitative. Hence, it cannot be coextensive with anything. Extension is a bodily property. What is not a body, but the opposing spiritual type of reality, has no such extension. But where there is no extension, there is no spatial distinction, nothing of here-ness or there-ness. How then can a placeless being of this sort undergo division?
Instead of thinking about the omnipresent in bodily spatial images, Plotinus says we must strive to think of how souls are present to each other.
They are present, each to all, as never having been set in opposition. They are no more hedged off by boundaries than are the multiple items of knowledge in one mind.
To make his point, Plotinus is driven to employ a host of riddling expressions. The omnipresent is both nowhere and everywhere. It's present wherever its powers reach, but it's both present and yet at the same time separate, multiple and yet one. Obviously, Plotinus is dealing here with a terribly difficult idea. It's no wonder, then, that study of Augustine's early writings shows that it took him several years to gain command of this concept of integral omnipresence. His Cassette dialogues hint vaguely at it here and there, but Augustine shows no signs of being able to use it in any formal or sophisticated way. The relative absence in the Cassette dialogues of omnipresence thinking contrasts markedly with the startling way this notion penetrates the Confessions. Even after leaving Manichaeism, for example, Augustine still entertained a concept of God as extended through space.
My soul fashioned a God for itself, which extended through every place in the infinity of space, and it believed that this was you.
Now, some years later, Augustine describes the new view of divine reality that transcends all such sensist imagery. This view of divine reality, he claims, is authentically intellectual.
But you caressed my head and closed my eyes, and I awoke to see that you are infinite, but in a different fashion, and that way of seeing was not derived from a fleshly source. I saw that all finite realities are in you, but not as though you were a place. They were in you in a different fashion, because you uphold all things by your truth hand.
By God's truth hand, Augustine means the purely spiritual truth represented in the Christian faith as the eternal Son of the Father. Augustine deliberately employs a grammatically daring hyphenation, truth hand, to dramatize how the idea of integral omnipresence stunningly defies all sensist ways of thinking about God. The Confessions stress omnipresence thinking very strongly. But in the earlier Cassette dialogues, this insight is relatively absent. This contrast suggests that after 10 years, Augustine felt free to bring a number of insights into play which had not fully ripened as early as that spring and summer of the year 386. By carefully studying Augustine's writings from the first few years after the Cassette dialogues, we can see that those writings issued from a stubborn process of reading, reflection, and occasional self-correction. That way, Augustine first reached a tentative, then later a more confident synthesis. In short, Augustine had to work steadily over a number of years before he could produce the comprehensive worldview he presents in Book 7 of his Confessions. He worked in this worldview first in Italy, then after he returned to Africa in the year 388, but he continued to work on it at least up until the year 395, and probably till 397 or 398. But we've already glimpsed another fleeting indication of Augustine's developing worldview. We noticed earlier that when Augustine referred to the statement, "I am who am," from the book of Exodus, he interpreted it as meaning that divine truth exists in a way that utterly transcends all created realities. Does Augustine imply by this that everything else besides God exists in some lesser, attenuated fashion? Puzzling though that may sound, Augustine's very next paragraph in the Confessions tells us we've understood him correctly.
And I examined those other realities inferior to you, and I saw that they do not altogether exist, nor do they altogether not exist. For they do exist, since they derive their existence from you, and yet they do not altogether exist, since they are not what you are. For that alone truly exists, which endures without any change.
Anything that changes, therefore, even anything that's capable of changing, cannot be said to exist in the fullest sense of that term. Augustine here applies the Neo-Platonic insight that there are ascending grades of goodness and beauty. But Augustine's also reminding us of an assumption that's fundamental to that insight. If we apply these grades of goodness and beauty to human beings and other beings, we must then acknowledge that beings are more or less real. They approximate more or less truly the perfect pattern of an ideal being. If we grade anything on its goodness, beauty, or authenticity, we have necessarily graded it on the quality of its reality. This does not mean that the Platonist is uninterested in answering simple yes or no questions, such as, is this a human being? The Platonist knows, as does the Aristotelian, that such questions can be answered by exploring whether or not the definition of human being correctly applies to the specimen under examination. But the Platonist is perhaps even more interested in a different range of questions. He's particularly interested in evaluative questions like, how good a person is this? Or how true is it to say that this man is a genuinely human being? Like any Platonist, Augustine would recognize grades of perfection among the members of any single class of beings. For example, some humans are more human, and some horses are horsier than others. Augustine would also say that different classes of beings can be similarly graded, one class relative to the others. He sees, for example, that stones, cabbages, antelopes, and humans are all beings, in the sense that they all exist. But Augustine adds the qualification that each of these different types of being exists in either lower or higher degrees. Their very reality is qualitatively inferior or superior in kind. Augustine's evaluative style of thinking will soon furnish him with a kind of qualitative ladder. With it he will ascend mentally from the realities of human experience to the divine reality beyond the reach of direct human contact.
I began to ask why I found myself positively evaluating the beauty of bodily realities, and what empowered me to judge aright, as when I said things about changeable realities like, "This being here is as it should be, but not so that one over there." Probing then into why I made such judgments, for make them I did, I saw that I had come to discover the unchangeable and true eternity of truth, which exists above my changeable mind.
We all make such judgments, Augustine reminds us. We all rank certain realities as relatively inferior or superior to others in their class. We also sometimes rank one entire class of realities relative to another class. But we can make no such relative rankings unless we implicitly refer to some absolute standard of evaluation. As Plato frequently argued, we can't say this is more beautiful than that, unless we have some notion of what we mean by absolute and perfect beauty. Then, once we're secure in that realization, we can pursue that upward ascent which Augustine describes.
Thus I passed gradually upward from bodies to soul, and thence to the soul's highest reasoning power. When this my reasoning power proved to be a changeable reality, it stretched itself upward to its power of understanding, in order to discover what light it was that flooded into it whenever it proclaimed, beyond all doubting, that the unchangeable must be ranked superior to the changeable, and by the same token to discover whence it gained that knowledge of the unchangeable. For it must possess that knowledge in some fashion, else it could never so unhesitatingly have ranked the unchangeable over the changeable. Thus, in a flash of trembling sight, it came to glimpse that which exists, God.
This ascending process is sometimes referred to as the Augustinian proof for the existence of God. Looked at more closely, though, Augustine's saying that none of us really needs a proof for God's existence. In the moment we make any judgment of relative value, Augustine claims that we implicitly acknowledge an absolute standard of value. This absolute, Augustine would assure us, is God. We have seen that Augustine's mature concept of God as a spaceless, timeless reality reached its full development some years after he wrote the Cassette dialogues. There's scarcely a trace in the dialogues of his insight that there are grades of being. He's glimpsed that certain things are superior to others in their goodness or their beauty, but he's not yet gotten the insight that these grades of goodness and beauty mean that the beings in question are also more or less real, more or less truly existent. Augustine began experimenting with this notion only when writing the little work On the Immortality of the Soul, some time after his return from Cassette to Milan. Even later, Augustine begins deliberately to apply the precise method of ascending the grades of being. Hence, while this central section of the Confessions might initially appear to describe Augustine's first acquaintance with Neoplatonic writings, it's in fact something quite different. It's a highly condensed summary of the later worldview to which Augustine came only gradually. He'd caught glimmers of it at Milan, had begun to elaborate it in the Cassette dialogues, then worked at it perseveringly during the years which followed. This finding is a comforting one. It assures us that understanding this section of the Confessions is tantamount to understanding Augustine's mature worldview. One additional feature of Augustine's grades of being concept deserves attention. Augustine describes the unchangeable light that he's glimpsed, and he says that it revealed to him truth, eternity, and love.
Whoever knows the truth knows that light, and whoever knows that light knows eternity. Love knows it, O eternal truth, and true love, and beloved eternity. You are my God, and I sigh for you, day and night.
Here Augustine's clearly alluding to the Christian Trinity. Truth is identified with the Divine Son, love with the Holy Spirit, and eternity, mentioned 3 distinct times, seems to characterize both the person of the Father and also the nature of the Godhead. We can compare that with Augustine's further comment that creatures both are and are not.
For that which truly exists remains unchangeable, but the good for me consists in cleaving fast to my God. For if I do not remain in him, I shall not be able to remain in myself. But he, remaining in himself, renews all things.
Augustine's told us that only God truly exists, only God in the fullest sense of the term. But observe how strongly he hammers home the precise reason why that's so. The mark of perfect and plenary existence is, to his mind, unchangeableness, or eternity. That which truly exists, he writes, remains or endures unchangeably. Augustine uses a Latin term that we translate as endure or remain. That term, manere, implies 2 things. First, that God remains in the sense that he continues to exist. Second, the term further implies that God unchangeably remains exactly what he is. God suffers no alteration whatever in the incomparably perfect way he exists. Eternity, or immutability, is the first property that occurs to Augustine when characterizing the nature of God. By the same token, the first adjective he uses to characterize all other realities is mutable, changeable, or temporal. This constitutes the radical difference between God and creatures, a difference which appears so radical, in fact, that some thinkers have wondered whether there could be any positive relationship between an utterly unchangeable God and a constantly changing world. And yet, Augustine insists, God could not renew all things, could not be creator of the ever-changing world, unless he remained utterly in himself.
I saw that you, who alone are eternal, did not begin to work after innumerable tracts of time, because all tracts of time, and everything that has passed and will pass away, would neither go out of being nor come into being unless you remained, and remained at work.
The book of Genesis tells us that God rested on the 7th day of creation. The ordinary reader might be tempted to infer from that God still remains immutably at rest, but in that case, what would become of Christ's saying that the Father works until now, and I work too? Augustine takes the dilemma by both horns. God's remainingness or abidingness is precisely the changelessness of a God unremittingly engaged in renewing all things in the changing world. Creatures, on the other hand, cannot, by their very nature, remain exactly what they are and the way they are from one moment to the next. Indeed, to exist in time, they must move inexorably from moment to moment in an unending series of losses and gains, dyings and renewals.
Whatever can change is not, once changed, what it was. And if it is not what it was, a certain death has taken place in it. Something that was there has been taken away and is not any more. The darkness of his hair has died on the head of the graying elder. Dead is the strength of the body, which now is ill.
Temporal life, in one of Augustine's unforgettable coinages, is a living death, a dying life. So he depicts his own life. To live as a child, he must die to his infancy. To live as an adolescent, he must die to his boyhood, and so on to that final divestment when we die to old age and step into the life after death. In his famous meditation on eternity and time in the 11th book of the Confessions, Augustine shows that the same thing is true of our every passing moment. Our life is like a line of poetry. The first syllable, even the first portion of the first syllable, must necessarily die away in order for the second mini-portion to begin its own fleeting existence. But what does this kind of thinking do to the present moments of our existence? In his Confessions, Augustine toys with the notion that the present moment might have no duration at all. But some years later he came to see that, strictly speaking, there is no such thing as a durationless instant.
I look for a present moment, but nothing stands still. What I have spoken no longer exists. What I am about to say does not yet exist. Talk about changing things, and all you can find is was and will be. But talk about God, and you will find only is.
Let's apply Augustine's own example of the syllable. Think of how you pronounce the very word, time. The T must stop sounding to let the I begin to sound, and so on for the M and the E, which doesn't sound at all. But trying to locate the precise moment when the T stops sounding and the I begins is as contradictory as inserting a gap of silence into an unbroken flow of sound. If we try to imagine the present as an indivisible instant that's neither past nor future, we soon realize that such an instant could have no thickness, no duration, whatever. It would be an instant out of time, not a moment of and in time. Even the word instant, which comes from the Latin word for stand, is deceptive. It caters to the illusion that we might discover some moment of time which actually stands still. But the frightening truth about our temporal existence is that we never do stand still. We are radically and irremediably unstable. We're like someone swept along by a river in flood. Our feet flail about trying to touch bottom so we can take a stand. But the bottom's beyond our reach. Indeed, the terrifying thought is that there may be no bottom at all. Heraclitus, centuries before, had pointed to the same experience.
You could not step twice into the same rivers, for other and yet other waters are flowing on. Other things enter the same rivers, and other waters pour in upon them.
Augustine comes very close to outdoing Heraclitus. If we carry Augustine's thought to its logical conclusion, we may say that you can't step into the same river even once. So Augustine brilliantly conveys a sense of insecurity, of vertigo, of stomach-wrenching panic. That seizure of angst, to borrow a modern word, is very much part of Augustine's feeling for time and temporal existence. That may go far to explain why he insists so strongly on what eternity really means.
God's years are not something other than God himself. God's years are his eternity, and eternity is God's very substantial reality, in which there is nothing changeable. Nothing is past there as though it no longer existed. Nothing there is future, as though not yet existing. There is nothing in him but is.
Eternity, for Augustine, is not simply a kind of everlastingness. It's not an infinite length of time. Having neither beginning nor end, this would put God into time and change. It would accord him the kind of existence that shot through, like our own, with non-existence. It would make God as radically unstable and metaphysically insecure as we are. But Augustine's convinced that God truly deserves the Jewish name used in the Old Testament, the Rock. For God alone stands. He alone is stable, solid, utterly secure. So for Augustine, the natural partner to God's immutability is his unchanging eternity.
This is the end of Side 1. Please fast forward and turn over your cassette.
To Augustine, the primary characteristic of God is his immutability, his eternity. The primary characteristic of mortal existence is time and change. You might be tempted to infer that all creatures are doomed to remain forever haunted by the metaphysical vertigo of being in time. Surprisingly, though, Augustine doesn't think so. This is the hidden implication of those cryptic expressions we've seen him employ, that his good consists in cleaving to the eternal God. Augustine believes man cannot remain in himself unless he remains in God. He's convinced that by cleaving or adhering to God, he'll soon become transformed by that union and come to remain as God himself remains. In Augustine's changing life amid changing realities, he is far from God, in what he calls a region of unlikeness to God. Despite his previous doubts about the existence of spiritual realities, he has now seen the invisible, so to speak. Hence he can say once again to his God,
When first I came to know you, you took me up so that I might see that what I saw existed.
But then he goes on to add a curious phrase.
I, who was doing the seeing, did not yet exist.
He did not yet exist. This expression, coming from a professional wordsmith who prided himself on his exact use of the Latin language, certainly must have been meant to catch our attention. Augustine's unmistakably implying that he may later come to exist in an unqualified sense, that is, in the absolute sense which until now seemed to apply only to God. But where does he derive this hope to exist later on? Augustine claims to have heard God's private voice from the very highest answering that question. The answer is couched in terms which remind him that up to this moment he's been a spiritual infant. Augustine hopes we're aware that the Apostle Paul used the same metaphor in writing to the Christians of Corinth. Paul could dispense only milk to them. They needed to grow up before he could feed them on the solid food reserved for spiritual adults. So God tells Augustine,
I am the food of grown-ups. Grow, and you will feed upon me. And you will not change me into yourself as you do with fleshly food, but you shall be changed into me.
Here Augustine is testing his readers. He knows we find God's answer obscure. For now he's prodding us to continue reading until he clarifies how we're to interpret that puzzling phrase, to feed upon God. That clarification comes when Augustine describes the mystical experience that he and his mother later enjoyed together at Ostia. Together they ascended from their spiritual height to further spiritual height until they reached the peak.
We attained to the region of unfailing abundance, where you, Lord, forever pasture Israel upon the food which is truth. And life there is identical with that wisdom by which all things are made. And this wisdom is such as it was, and so it will be forever. Nay, rather, only to be belongs to it, for it is eternal.
Here we have Augustine's own interpretation of what he means by feeding on God. It's the same activity the angels and blessed saints pursue in heaven. For there, he tells us, God himself forever pastures Israel upon the food which is truth. Augustine goes on to identify that truth as God's own divine wisdom. This is what Augustine the preacher means by the food of grown-up souls. But what food must we spiritual infants eat in hopes of becoming grown-ups? Augustine answers that this food is the teaching and the sacramental body of Christ. To Christians, Jesus Christ represents the divine wisdom who became incarnate, the eternal Word who became flesh for mankind to feed on. But both these varieties of spiritual food, whether for infants or grown-ups, possess the same remarkable property. Instead of our changing them into our own substance, the way we turn everyday food into our own flesh and blood, the change in this case works in reverse fashion. Augustine would have us believe that when we feed on the Eucharistic Christ, we are turned into him and become members of his body. This was the import of the command that Augustine tells us he received from God.
Grow, and you will feed upon me. You will not change me into yourself, but you shall be changed into me.
Here Augustine has boldly set the music of Plotinus's philosophy into a Christian key. But Plotinus, in his turn, was only being faithful to the description of heaven that Plato gave in his dialogue Phaedrus. Taking his cue from Plato, Plotinus explains how this ultimate vision of heaven affects anyone who experiences it.
The seer comes to unity with himself, and making no more separation, is one and altogether with that God silently present, and is with him as much as he wants to be and can be. How then can anyone be in beauty without seeing it? If he sees it as something different, he is not yet in beauty. He is in it most perfectly when he becomes it.
Expressions like these made Augustine feel philosophically warranted in affirming that in the heavenly vision, our nature as temporal beings will not keep us separate from the eternal God, nor shall we become like God by making him temporal like ourselves. Rather, when we see God, we shall become one with him, in the sense that he will eternalize us, make us sharers in his eternal mode of existing. Like Augustine, we do not yet exist in that plenary and absolute fashion. But Augustine wants us to believe that if we follow Christ the way, we can hope that God will eventually confer that style of existence upon us. But it's not enough for Augustine to justify these views philosophically. He must have scriptural grounds as well. His favorite scriptural text for illustrating the eternalizing effect of that vision of God comes from the first epistle of St. John, where St. John tells his readers,
Beloved, we are God's children now. It does not yet appear what we shall be, but we know that when he appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is.
Augustine explains St. John's words.
We are, and yet we shall be, something. But what more can we be than what we are? Listen to this. It has not yet appeared what we shall be. We know that when he appears, we shall be like to him. How so? Because we shall see him as he is.
We are now temporal beings, but Augustine interprets St. John as saying that we shall be like the God we see, eternalized as he is eternal. Augustine has fused the Christian Bible with Platonic philosophy to produce another of those Christian philosophical amalgams, so typical of his personal way of thinking. Augustine's fascinated with eternity. This is one reason why he constantly associates our heavenly contemplation of God with properties like changelessness, rest, and peace.
That Sabbath will be unending. Our rest there will be ineffable, beyond all describing. To that rest we are drawn, for just as in the flesh we are born to toil, so we are spiritually reborn to rest. For God is truth unchangeable and unfailing, unending, stable, and forever abiding incorruptibly. And this truth will be our food, and our rest like a lying down with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. We shall see perfectly, because we shall enjoy the most perfect leisure.
Augustine insists that our truest life, the one our hearts most deeply long for, is not this life of activity and time. Our truest life is that contemplative life in eternity. So, in summarizing his worldview in the Confessions, Augustine begins with a rich meditation on temporal and eternal being, and on the corresponding attitudes of action and contemplation. But what does he mean in the next lines when he brings up the subject of human iniquity?
You have taught man a lesson on account of his iniquity, and made my soul dry up like a spider's web.
Here Augustine implies that our very mortality is a punishment for the mysterious offense he calls iniquity. Plainly, Augustine believes that our present life of temporal instability and restless activity is what he calls a region of unlikeness, into which, he says, we have all wandered a great way off. It's true that we do not yet exist in the fullness of eternalized contemplation, but according to Augustine, the balancing truth may be that in some largely forgotten yet dimly remembered past, we once did exist that way. If this is what he means, it's fair to say he's infuriatingly artful in saying so. Or maybe he's just doing what he says Scripture often does, teasing us with puzzling obscurities, keeping us in suspense so the complete picture he's painting will be all the more striking when he sets it before us. By reflecting jointly on the Christian scriptures and the writings of Plotinus, Augustine eventually formulated an original view of knowledge and reality. This resolved his problem of relating faith and reason more cogently than the Manichees had done. Now, when he refers to iniquity, we know he's about to broach that second problem the Manichees also claim to have solved, better than the Catholic teachers, the mystery of evil. Augustine has embodied his earliest reflections on this question in a dialogue titled simply, On Order. Modern translators have, not so simply, but accurately, expanded that to read something like On Evil and God's Providential Order. Augustine had heard a suggestion, no doubt from Ambrose, that the evils we undergo are a punishment we've earned by our iniquity, that is, some evil we've freely committed. So we must distinguish between the evils we suffer and the evils we commit. And indeed, Augustine reserves the term iniquity for the evils we commit. But can we come to know that the evils we suffer are exactly proportioned to the evils we commit? Is it true that the universe is so impeccably ordered by God's providential governance that rewards always perfectly match up with good actions and punishments with sinful actions? Augustine thinks this can be demonstrated by reason, but he's far from satisfied with his earliest attempt to do that in the dialogue On Order. He wrestles with the question again and again in the series of works he wrote between the years 386 and 396. Again, the solution he presents in his Confessions bears earmarks of the one he'd hammered into final shape sometime in 395 or 396. The Manichees, he's now convinced, went about the question from the wrong end. They asked, where does evil come from, before they'd gotten straight on the first question, what is evil? To this question, they just assumed the answer. Evil was some presence, some substantial darkness which they equated with matter. Now Augustine's come to see that evil's not a substantial reality after all. It's always a kind of lack, a deprivation, which harms, or as he puts it, corrupts the substantial being it affects.
Beings which undergo corruption are nevertheless good. For if they were not good at all, there would be nothing in them to be corrupted. For corruption damages a being, but there would be no damage done unless the thing's goodness were somehow diminished. Therefore all things which undergo corruption suffer some deprivation of good.
So Augustine concludes, for corruption to be possible, the corruptible being must be good in some measure. He now draws a sweeping conclusion.
Hence, so long as things exist, they are good. Therefore, whatever exists is good. And this so-called evil, whose origin I had been seeking, is not a substantial reality after all. Hence I saw, and it was made manifest to me, that you, Lord, have made all things good, and that no substantial beings whatever exist which you have not made.
So much for the Manichee claim that there are a host of evil realities that are not creatures made by the good God. But if nothing whatsoever is evil in God's sight, why do we humans think of some things like scorpions or mosquitoes as evil? Augustine answers,
Certain beings are thought to be evils, because they do not suit certain others. Yet those very beings suit others still, and besides, they are also good in themselves, and suit this lower portion of our universe, which we call Earth.
Augustine's making essentially the same distinction that we saw him use in his youthful work on the beautiful and the fitting. The mosquito is a bothersome inconvenience. It's unsuitable to us humans. So we think of mosquitoes as evil, but male mosquitoes suit female mosquitoes very well. Besides, if we examine the mosquito with enough detachment as an object of aesthetic appraisal, we would see its elegant symmetry and balance, the beauty or goodness in and for itself, which even the lowly mosquito displays. But Augustine also claims that creatures like the mosquito are suitable to this lower portion of our universe, which we call Earth. He's assuming that we're familiar with the first verse of Genesis, that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. He also assumes we'll agree that heaven means the higher spiritual creation, while earth refers to the lower corporeal realm we humans inhabit. But just as our bodies befit this lower corporeal realm, so it is with creatures like the mosquito. They're good since they go well with certain ecological niches found on earth. Further on, he expands on this same theme. The perception of evil, he reminds us, is often relative.
And I knew from experience that it was scarcely to be marveled at, that bread itself, good though it tastes to a healthy palate, can displease an unhealthy one. So too your justice can seem displeasing to the iniquitous.
Now, he continues,
But because you have not made all things to be equal, for this reason do all things exist. For each individual thing is good, but the assemblage of all things existing together is very good. For our God has made all things very good.
This is the final insight Augustine needs to refute the Manichees, and he seems to have hit on it only in the year 395 or so. Again, he's thinking of the creation account in the book of Genesis. Here God pronounces after each of the first 5 days of creation that day was good. But only after the last day of creation, when God beholds all things that he has created, does he pronounce them very good. Why do all things merit being called very good? Because, Augustine thinks, the entirety of creaturely reality makes up a cascade of beings running from more perfect to less perfect. The result is a complete range of being possibilities, from the highest of angels to the lowest of worms. And this entire gamut of being possibilities is artistically ordered in hierarchic beauty from top to bottom. The Platonists insisted that anything less perfect than this full orchestration of created realities would be unworthy of the perfect, God. Augustine interprets the Bible as intimating the same message. Yet the Manichees held that a good God would create superior spiritual realities, but would have stopped short of creating the inferior realities they found so annoying. Augustine exclaims,
Far be it from me any longer to say, these inferior realities should not exist. For if they were the only realities I beheld, I grant that I would long for realities superior to them. And still I ought now praise you, Lord, for these and these alone. For everything on earth, as well as in the heavens, shows forth your praise.
As a Manichee, Augustine had thought differently. But now that attitude is once and for all behind him.
No more did I long for the superior realities of the spiritual world, because now I was thinking in terms of the all things. And while superior realities do possess more goodness than inferior realities, I now leveled the healthier-minded judgment that it was better that all things should exist than that superior realities alone should exist.
The delicate balance, or maybe we should say the subtle ambiguity of Augustine's attitude here is worth noticing. His Platonist readings have provided him with the intellectual concepts for interpreting the biblical account of creation. His erstwhile resentment that this lower material world existed at all has been dissolved. Yet he still feels nostalgic for the higher spiritual world. Only there, he knows, can we enjoy that immediate vision of God which alone can make us happy. Augustine now interrupts the exposition of his worldview to remind his readers why he'd become a Manichae in the first place. It was the problem of evil, certainly, but there was more to it than that. For the problem of evil itself became intractable for him because he persisted in thinking about God's relation to the created world in spatial and bodily terms. Now Augustine tells us he sees that God is not in created realities. He's not located here or there in a series of spatial containers.
All finite things are in you, not in a spatial, but in a different manner, because you hold all things in your truth hand.
Again, Augustine hopes that we will understand God's truth hand as meaning God the Father's Son. Scripture identifies the divine Son as eternal truth, and also as the hand of God, symbolizing the creative power by which God fashions everything he makes. This twin allusion to truth and eternity explains where Augustine's mind moves next. First, he follows up on the truth theme, and in a manner that perfectly parallels his prior description of goodness.
And all things are true in the measure in which they exist, and nothing is false except inasmuch as what does not exist is thought to exist.
Augustine's already told us, however, that what truly exists, exists eternally. This brings him now to the relation of the eternal Creator with his temporal creatures.
And I saw that everything is suited, not only to its place in the universe, but to its time as well, and that you, Lord, who alone are eternal, did not begin to create after numberless intervals of time, because all such intervals of time, whether they have passed away or will pass away, could neither come into being nor pass out of being, unless you, Lord, were at work and standing fast.
Now at last, Augustine returns to the question of iniquity that he'd brushed against earlier, but had passed over. Significantly, the relationship of the eternal God to his temporal creation has raised that question again.
And I sought to uncover what iniquity might be, and I found that it was not any kind of substance, but the will's perversity, twisting itself away from you, Lord, highest of substances, toward the lowest of realities, and casting forth its insides and swelling outwards.
Those two phrases, casting forth its insides and swelling outwards, come from a startling image which occurs in the book of Ecclesiasticus. The biblical author there describes the proud person in exactly those terms. Earlier in his work on music, Augustine used that very text from Ecclesiasticus to characterize the proud soul's fall from eternal contemplation into the restless activity of temporal life. Then later, when musing on eternity and its relation to time in Book 11 of his Confessions, Augustine will climax that meditation by invoking the identical image in strikingly similar language. Augustine portrays his soul, in his words, as having leapt apart into time in a leap that has rent asunder its innermost entrails. How did Augustine mean us to understand this strange image of our entrance into the life of time and action? Is he implying that we formerly existed in the same way we now hope to exist in heaven? Were we eternalized, contemplatively united with, fused, as it were, into God's own eternity? If that's what he intended, then our very presence in this life of time and change and restless activity must be a punishment for some primordial iniquity we committed. But when? And where? Those questions forcefully recall the very ones Augustine addresses to God in the first book of his Confessions.
Tell me whether my infancy followed upon some other age of mine that had already died, or was it that age which I passed within my mother's womb? But what was there even before this, my joy, my God? Was I anywhere or anyone?
The question is given an even keener edge if we take seriously what Scripture tells us, that our iniquity may date from even before our life in the womb.
But if I was conceived in iniquity, and in sin did my mother nourish me within her womb, Where, I pray to you, my God, where, Lord, where or when was I, your servant, innocent?
Scholars of Augustine's works still disagree on how to resolve the difficulties embedded in his confessions. Many an ordinary reader, too, comes away from Augustine's masterpiece with a host of questions. What does it mean to be human? Does some pristine guilt cast its shadow over our race? And how much should the believing Christian feel at home with the values of the secular world? After 15 centuries, we still have much to learn about this great and influential, but often disconcerting thinker. But however one chooses to settle such issues, this much is clear. The view of the human condition that Augustine embodied in his Confessions, and which we've been exploring here, remained substantially unchanged until his death in the year 430. And fundamental to Augustine's view was the contention that human life, as we experience it, is entirely too miserable to be anything other than the God-appointed punishment for some primal iniquity the human race must have committed. To put it as the book of Job does, human life is one sustained, unremitting trial, punitive as well as purifying. Augustine thought that one of the most convincing indications that our human lives are a form of punishment is this. Our hearts long for contemplative union with God, and yet the sense of alienation from that blissful union torments us unremittingly. This longing for union with God pursued Augustine his whole life long. On his return from Italy to Africa, he settled first in his native town, Thagaste. Promptly, he gathered a like-minded group about him in what we would today call a monastery. They studied and discussed together, they reflected and prayed, they often wrote out the results of their reflection for the benefit of their fellow Catholics. In time, Augustine's writings would grow in influence. In the year 391, 5 years after his conversion, Augustine was called by Bishop Valerius of the nearby seaport city of Hippo Regius to be ordained a priest. Despite the busy character of his priestly duties, however, Augustine and some of his companions moved to Hippo and continued to live the monastic life. Even when consecrated Bishop of Hippo in the year 395, Augustine persisted in living as a monk. The Confessions records his persistent yearning for the life of contemplation.
The drops of time are precious to me. For a long time have I burned to meditate on your law. On this and nothing else would I want those hours to flow away. Hours which I find free from the needs of refreshing both body and mind, and from the demands of such service as we owe to our fellow humans, and such service as we do not owe, but render nonetheless.
That sense of alienation, along with the yearning for a contemplative union with God, is the mainspring of Augustine's synthesis all his life long. When the Donatist sect strove to establish a native African church to rival the Universal Cattolica, he was able to combat that schism with the same synthesis he'd forged to answer the Manichae heresy. It required only minor alterations. Similar minor adjustments did the job when the Irish monk Pelagius came to Africa with his teaching that human beings were born into the world sinless, innocent, and fully equipped by nature to live the Christian life virtuously. In the year 410, the barbarian hordes from the north finally broke through the empire's last defenses and sacked the city of Rome. This prompted a tide of resentment against Christianity. Those who remained faithful to pagan religion blamed the Christians for outlawing the worship of the traditional gods and goddesses. Those gods and goddesses, the pagans argued, had assured Rome's safety and prosperity for so many centuries. Against this revival of paganism, Augustine wrote the masterpiece of his declining years, The City of God. His central message remained the same. Again, he leveled the very same batteries as he did against Manichaees, Donatists, and Pelagians. The opening section of the work is directed against the city of man, as Rome represented it. The Romans hoped for happiness here, in this life. That worldview, Augustine argues, is demonstrably foolish. Hence it would be comparably foolish to expend too much attention on the problem of political organization. These questions affect our temporal lives here, below, but Christians look forward to the true joys awaiting them in the heavenly Jerusalem, the city of God. Despite that disclaimer, the city of God is spiced with a number of sagacious observations about politics and government, but they're far from the center of Augustine's interests. In the second portion of the City of God, Augustine gives his estimate of Greek culture. The best of the Greek philosophers, he claims, the Platonists, were closest to the Judeo-Christian view. They had the wisdom to see that happiness must be an otherworldly affair. Happiness belongs to the immortal soul rather than the body. Augustine agrees with the Greek thinkers who held that happiness will take the form of contemplative vision.
For that vision of God is a vision of so great a beauty, and is so infinitely worthy of love, that Plotinus does not hesitate to say that he who is crowned with all other blessings, but has not this, is the most miserable of men.
In the major portion of the City of God, Augustine fills out and occasionally corrects the teachings of Greek philosophers by insights drawn from Scripture. This leads him to conclude that we should place our hopes for bliss in that other eternal life which Christ, the incarnate Son of God, purchased for us by his suffering and death. Augustine believes that God created the human soul as an image of his Trinitarian nature, and he devotes 7 of the 15 books entitled On the Trinity to show that the soul cannot find happiness in anything less than the direct and immediate vision of God. Augustine had best expressed this desire for a vision of God in that famous exclamation in his Confessions.
You have made us for yourself, Lord, and our hearts are restless till they rest in you.
Rest in God will be the cessation of everything we do. Blissful repose in the unchanging stillness of vision. God will enable us to see him as he sees himself, see him as he truly is. Eternalized by him, we shall be like him, and
he shall be the end of our every desire. He who shall be seen with no end to the seeing, loved without love ever cloying, praised without praise ever wearying. There we shall rest and behold, behold and love, love and praise. See what it will be like in that end without ending.
to that vision, Christians believe, Augustine passed in August of 430, in his 76th year. His dying entirely befitted his life. During his last days, the same barbarians who'd already devastated Italy and Sicily were hammering at the gates of Hippo Regius. Augustine spent his time praying over and over the so-called penitential psalms from the Bible. And yet his companion Posidius has told us what may have been the dying words of this great Catholic bishop.
He consoled himself amid the disasters surrounding him by repeating the saying of a certain sage, "No great man is he who thinks it a great affair that bricks and beams should fall and mortals die."
That sage was none other than the pagan Plotinus.
We hope you have enjoyed this presentation of St. Augustine by Knowledge Products. The script for this presentation is by R.J. O'Connell, a Jesuit priest and professor of philosophy at Fordham University. The script is edited by Professor John Locks of Vanderbilt University and Mike Hassel of Knowledge Products. Produced by Pat Childs. Vocal characterizations are by
Travis Hardison, Joe Keenan, Paul Meyer, Pat Childs, John Sherberg, and Robert Wynn.
Music is by Ralph Childs. Recorded at Fred Jones Recording Services and Archer Productions. This material may not be copied in whole or in part without the written permission of the copyright owner. Copyright 1990 by Carmichael & Carmichael Incorporated. This presentation of the Giants of Philosophy is a part of the Audio Classics series, a continuing series of cassettes presenting the major ideas of great thinkers with a discussion of their historical and intellectual context.